Why does our society laud the violence of football but demonizes video game violence? Gotta be honest with you, I love football. The big plays, the athleticism, the battle of wits between the coaches, the sound of the offensive and defensive lines cracking together. But let's not forget the violence. There are the season-ending injuries, people getting knocked out, and the always odd and awkward helmet punch.
So happy together.
And I also, surprise, surprise, love video games. The rush of being in the zone, the joy of crushing your friends in battle, the journey into fantasy, the storytelling. But also there's the violence. Massive killing sprees, running someone over with your car, mutilating a crispy fella's limbs. These are common ways of interacting in games. On the one hand, it's kind of weird that society cheers the aggressiveness and hard hits in football. But on the other hand, when it comes to violent video games, we see congressional hearings, copious studies on the effects of violent video games on kids, and blaming school shootings on doom. So how is it that these two violent types of games coexist in our culture, but with wildly different perceptions? And just to lay my cards out on the table, this is a personal question for me. I mean, aside from the fact that I love video games, I played football for a big chunk of my life. My brother played football up through college. My dad played football in college. He actually met my mother in the band. So this really hits close to home. Before we get started, I want to be crystal clear about what I mean when I say that these games are violent. It's a phrase that's worth interrogating.
I want answers and I want them now.
We're not talking about real-world violence, which the American Psychological Association defines as an extreme form of aggression, such as assault, rape, or murder. Clearly not even the most painful helmet-dislodging tackle counts as that. But we are talking about a common understanding of violence as a form of aggression and domination against another person that takes place within the confines of the game.
It's in the game.
And the reason that one human being can tackle another human being at high speed and no one calls the cops is because games take place inside of what we call a magic circle. All that term means is that we acknowledge that we're playing, that our actions in games only apply within the game itself. In real life, it's not cool to blindside someone on the street, or melee them for that matter. So let's start with football. As a sport, it has a lot of great qualities: teamwork, discipline, performance under pressure, and as any NFL coach will tell you
play to win the game.
Football is incredibly complicated and requires an extraordinary level of intelligence to play at a high level. But regardless of the positives, and there are many, football is a full contact sport, and thus the main mechanic of the game is domination. And as a result, you see a ton of injuries.
He'll get a shot at it. Whoa!
Over 4,000 former NFL players sued the league because of concussions. High school players have been paralyzed, or even worse, have died. But in spite of all this, we still celebrate great defenses, huge hits, and brilliant stiff arms. We cheer football players on and glorify their brutality in highlight reels on national television. Obviously, people recognize how dangerous football can be, since we keep updating the equipment and tweaking the rules to make the game safer. So why is much of America fine with all this? I mean, football is as popular as it's ever been. There's a couple reasons. One, the game is firmly rooted in American culture and has had time to weather complaints. In 1904, there were 18 football-related deaths, according to the Chicago Tribune. President Roosevelt actually threatened to ban the game because it was so violent. This resulted in some new rules, like the creation of the forward pass. Second, because of growth over time and its foundation in college athletics, there's an institutional acceptance of football at a very broad level. Football earns the University of Texas around $109 million a year, which funds all the other sports that don't really make money. And finally, it's socially acceptable because football ostensibly says something about what we want young men to be.
Mr. I'll make a man out of you.
We celebrate the indestructibleness of men who can take a hit, and we want them to be leaders on and off the field. For Americans, whether we like it or not, football is part of who we are. But if we're so accepting of this violent game, why are video games perceived as so much worse?
How do video games affect your brain?
As we've talked about before, violence in video games is often feared even though no one is actually getting hurt. Unless you're playing Pain Station, which I have, and yeah, that really stinks. And despite this, there's been congressional hearings, a recent Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association, and a mountain of academic research saying how games make you violent.
You can't
What's strange though is that video games have many of the same qualities that we love about football. RTS games like StarCraft demonstrate the same high-level strategy of professional football coaches in these do-or-die scenarios. And in multiplayer games like Dota, League of Legends, and Team Fortress 2, each player is expected to perform a very specific role, mirroring the same type of intense specialization of professional football and teaching the importance of teamwork. So why is it that people are having a knee-jerk reaction to video games violence and not football's? The first big reason is that video games look a lot more violent than football because the violence displayed represents our society's taboos. That could be running over cops in Grand Theft Auto, dragging dead bodies and stowing them in dumpsters in Hitman, or, I don't know, violating the Geneva Conventions in Call of Duty. So the fear of violence in video games is almost always centered around the idea that the repetitive in-game actions will somehow breach the magic circle that I mentioned earlier. And those actions will leak into the real world and cause kids not just to become aggressive and domineering adults, but, you know, murderers.
These games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture.
And video games are a softer target than, say, the equally violent movies because in games, you're the one who's doing it, or at least that's what I'm told. But even more importantly, when you look at history, video game controversies always seem to pop up when something related to the game's content is going really badly in society. People like to point at video games as a scapegoat instead of looking at the real problem because frankly, that's just easier. Death Race 2000 drew public ire because you ran over pedestrians, even though it looks ridiculous. It seems like a very dumb controversy in retrospect, but you have to remember the game was released in the mid-70s at a time when traffic fatalities were at historic highs. During the 1980s, there was this weird satanic scare that people were blaming on Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, the satanic rituals turned out to be a total hoax, but hey, it's easier just to point the finger at D&D.
A teenager doesn't manufacture a desire to see blood or taste blood.
The 1993 hearings on violent games occurred at a time when violent crime, manslaughter, and assault were across the board the highest. And when Doom came out the same year, opponents called it a mass murder simulator, while gun fatalities in the US were at their peak. Because games allow us to enact metaphorical violence inside of them, naturally some people fear that it'll cross over into the real world. Meanwhile, football, a game that actually causes injuries to thousands of people, has been greatly ignored, at least until recently. The concerns that we're seeing about the sport of football have to do with the fear that the metaphorical violence of what's happening on the field in a full contact sport is now rearing its head off the field in the form of domestic abuse or long-term brain damage for the players. Overall, I do think it's a little ridiculous that we have this double standard about games as games. And either violent video games and football are part of the same acceptable realm of human activity, or they're not. To be clear, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have concussion protocols for player safety or ignore what athletes do off the field, or just throw away the rating system that keeps violent games out of kids' hands. But when we're talking about games, in this case the rules and mechanics of football, it's important to remember that the violence of two players hitting each other on the field isn't real, at least not in the same way as two people tackling each other at a Starbucks. Because if it were, we'd all be terrible people. So what do you think? Are video game violence and football violence the same thing? Or are they fundamentally different and should be treated as such? Hash it out in the comments, and if you like what you saw, please subscribe. I'll see you next week. Since I was away, there are 2 episodes that I'll need to comment on: the history of horror game mechanics and what is a game. Let's see what you had to say. So a bunch of you pointed out that we didn't have Silent Hill in our history of video game mechanics. Really sorry about that. It was in the original script, but somehow got left on the editing room floor. So yeah, you're totally right. You're all right. Sam Rogers says that every time I say hash it out in the comments, all he can think about is hash browns, which is completely intentional. That's what I want you to be thinking about. So a bunch of you said that you don't get scared by video games because they're video games and you know where you are and it doesn't really frighten you. Some people, like me, get really scared by games, or LOI, who got scared by this particular sequence in Kingdom Hearts, which is totally fine. I mean, fear is a relative thing. Not everyone's gonna be scared by the same exact things, but we are moving into a world with biofeedback. Recently, this Kickstarter project Nevermind is using biofeedback. I mentioned it in the episode. So those of you who don't get scared by games, don't worry, your day's coming. So for our What is a Game episode, Sis Helion makes an excellent point, which is that our definitions of game and play are going to be culturally conditioned. So in German, which is the language that Sis Helion speaks, there isn't a word for play or games. So that question of what is a game doesn't even really matter. It's completely moot because that word doesn't necessarily exist. So yeah, excellent point. Emil Danielson quotes the philosopher Wittgenstein, who said that games can't be defined in a classical sense, in large part because there will always be things that fall outside of the definition. You should read the entire comment. He does much better justice to Wittgenstein than I'm doing right now. But regardless, he does leave this last thought, which I agree with, which is that this conversation about what is and isn't a game doesn't need to be defined along, in a binary sense, like there have to be two sides. I structured it that way because that's kind of how the arguments rolled out, but it's much more three-dimensional than that. And Emil says that we can open up some new possibilities about what we think about the relative gameness of something. Remember, it's not just something is a game or isn't a game, but there are all these gray areas in between those two sort of places. Jeremy Greenlee and a bunch of others of you gave your own definitions for what is and isn't a game, which is awesome. Unfortunately, for every one of the definitions that you give, there's always going to be a little bit of an exception, which I would encourage you to work through. So for Jeremy defines games where you have agency or you have control over the outcome. Control in games can be kind of a tricky thing, like how much control? So if a game's on rails, you don't necessarily have control over where your movement is per se, or I don't know, in a storytelling game, you don't have control over every aspect of the story, like you can't just do whatever you want. So defining what control actually means in those contexts actually turns out to be really important. So that's why these definition things, they get pretty tricky. And finally, thanks for all of you who commented on my recent trip to Holland. I had an excellent time. The Dutch are wonderful people. I had a great time. And those of you who came to my event as part of the Impact Festival, which was great, especially to the young woman who after the event gave me an entire bag of stroopwafels, which I loved. They're delicious.